Thank you very much, Fatou. That was an incredible call to action. To those on the panel here, we've got ministers, we've got ambassadors, we've got chief negotiators, we've got those who are advising, those who are making the decisions. And we want to take your call to action, what we learned from the earlier panels today around what needs to happen next on the fossil fuel transition, where we need to see, we had that call from business to have clarity in the energy transition policies in countries' next nationally determined contributions. From our adaptation panel, we had a challenge directly to this panel today around how do we make sure that what gets decided at COP29 on the big ticket items around the new finance goal and the nationally determined contributions also factors in what countries need to do next on adaptation and how finance can be mobilized for adaptation. We've talked about the upcoming deadlines in 2025 for those nationally determined contributions, for the commitments countries have made to phase out coal, to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, to double adaptation finance. And we've heard about this new collective quantified goal. It's got so many letters in it. But the idea is really to set a new goal, a new vision for how finance can be mobilized and accessed, particularly for developing countries to implement their climate action. And we've just come out of the Bonn intersessional negotiations where we saw countries really engaging positively around how do we reach agreement on what that goal should look like, but quite far apart in their positions on what it should really look like. So we have an incredible panel with us here today. We have Ambassador Strickland, Head of Mission and Ambassador of Samoa to Belgium and the EU, and I learned earlier several other countries as well. Quite a busy job. You're accredited to the Court of St. James, and you're bringing to this panel 20 years of foreign ministry experience to talk through particularly how diplomacy can help us deliver the climate action that we've heard calls for today. We have Minister Rafiev, Chief Negotiator of Azerbaijan and the COP29 incoming presidency. We're really looking forward to hearing your experience, particularly across different elements of the multilateral sphere, human rights, the Sustainable Development Goals, how those different elements of multilateralism can come to bear to help drive the climate action we need to see from countries. Jake Werksman, lead negotiator of the European Union, really keen to hear your experience around working in different countries, different contexts, how that gamut of different perspectives from countries, from NGOs you've got experience in the past as well, can kind of add up to more than the sum of its parts to really get countries in the position to put that climate action on the table. And Camilla, born OBE, leading climate advocate, you've advised the COP26 and COP28 presidencies. We're really keen to hear from your experience how presidencies can work together and how we can really accelerate what needs to happen next. My name is Alex Scott. I'm a climate diplomacy consultant, and I'm coming to you with some experience in NGOs, in national and local government. And what I really want to hear from you as an audience today as well is your ideas, your questions to these decision makers and influencers around what types of diplomacy, whole of society diplomacy, bringing your different perspectives together, can really help get countries in the position to use COP29 as that milestone on finance, on the road to delivering those climate actions that Fatou called for in 2025 and now. And we'll make sure that we have plenty of time for you to bring your questions to the panel. So think about them as we're going through. But let's start with yourself, Ambassador Strickland. Samoa, small island states have really been at the forefront of both suffering climate change impacts, but also driving action on the international stage. We'd love to hear from you. What's been your experience of how climate change has been affecting Samoa and your peers, but also how that's changed your approach to diplomacy and what kind of approaches you've been taking to push action on the global stage?
Thank you very much, Alex. Can you all hear me in the back? My voice is a bit... Okay, good. And I would like to really thank the organizers, especially for turning down the heat right in the beginning, because that is the lived reality of us small island states. Someone keeps playing with the heat and keeps rising, and we have no idea who has the remote for the air conditioning. That is our lived reality as small island developing states. Everything that shouldn't increase seems to be increasing. Increasing sea level rises, increasing temperatures, increasing debt, increasing coastal erosion, increasing ocean acidification, and yet decreasing climate finance to support us to help adapt or deal with the loss and damages. So this, for us, climate change is the lived reality. And that is why, as the Pacific and the Pacific Island Forum has identified climate change, especially for us as PCIDS, as the single greatest threat to us as island nations. And we have also declared the Pacific, a blue Pacific climate emergency. And this is our reality, and that I can say short. I believe Fatu did a wonderful job highlighting some of the key examples. We have islands in the Pacific. Samoa has more than 70% of our population, all our infrastructure on low-lying parts of the island. So that's the huge threat that we have to face, and we're constantly seeing the ocean come in. But there are even islands in the Pacific that you don't have to have tidal waves. The sea is coming through the island. And this is our lived reality. And because of this threat and because of this reality, it's about survival for us. And that's why diplomacy becomes a tool for our survival. And for decades, we have been sounding the alarm about how we need, to do something about it. The most frustrating thing is, even if we have the most ambitious NDCs, all SIDS put together, it doesn't transform in the way that we need to address this issue. And that's the frustrating part. And that's why diplomacy becomes a key tool for survival for us as SIDS. And how have we changed? Well, we haven't stopped sounding the alarm, but we've tried to intensify our efforts. You've looked at the different ways that we try. We try and participate passionately in the UNFCCC process. We try and ensure that our special case as SIDS continues to be acknowledged because of the disproportionate impact that climate change has on us. The global community since the 90s have acknowledged that us as SIDS are a special case, and that we have special circumstances that we hope continues to be acknowledged when we look at COP processes, when we're trying to come up with these decisions. And I truly agree with what Fatu has also mentioned on that. And how it has changed our diplomacy. We don't just sit there and wait. Us as SIDS also have gone out there, despite the fact that we know no matter how much we mitigate or all the efforts we do, it still doesn't, it's only a drop in the ocean in the global temperature rise, but we still do it anyway. We take leadership. We look at different areas of trying to continue to sounding the alarm. Be it climate justice, we take it to the courts, ICJ, ITLOS. We take it to WHO, IMO, we take it wherever we can. For the Pacific Island Forum leaders, we've also looked at declaration that addresses the issue of sea level rise and the permanency of our boundaries. So we've taken it to UNCLOS, to ILC, to all the different multilateral platforms that we feel helps us raise the alarm on the issue. Talking about fossil fuel phase out and what we need to do, energy. But we don't just talk to leaders and member states, we're also trying to talk to scientists, talk to the youth. We have Pacific culture groups that do join and support the government to try and get the message out there, tell our stories, bring our music, bring it to the world. And it's not easy raising our voices as SIDS, because sometimes most of the dialogue that changes this agenda is held up north. Do you know how far Samoa is to fly all the way here to come and have our voices heard? So this is even the challenge. Even with technology, then you do meetings that's at 3 a.m. in the morning and you expect my prime minister to tune in. So I think these are some of the ongoing challenges. And I think at the end of the day, it's really about us ensuring that we raise the ambition and we continue to challenge everyone, from leaders to scientists, to the private sector, to the NGO, and to the youth, to keep the governments to continue to put pressure, and SIDS are happy to partner with everyone that can help bring this issue, and the urgency is the most important. Mm-hmm. So that's why as we sit here going to Baku, we can pressure as many leaders as we can, but I think each of you individually need to ask yourself, what role can you play to keep the momentum going, to come up with those innovative ideas, to put the pressure on, to help SIDS realize that we do need a 1.5 degree world for us to survive. That's how we've tried to change our approach to diplomacy. We've intensified it, but we've continued to call all the agenda of the COP. Everything is packaged in a way that we want to ensure a 1.5 degree world. Mm-hmm. And we still hope, while everything else is rising, we hope ambition rises with it, and it's matched with the climate finance that needs to come with it, as everyone has mentioned today. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have many of those stakeholders from science, from elements of diplomacy, from other parts of civil society in the audience. So we look forward to hearing your perspectives as well, and your advice to this panel on how they can use diplomacy to get us closer to where we need to be, to that 1.5 degree goal. Minister, you are responsible for getting us to that final outcome at COP29 with your COP president-designate and your team, of course. But what is the approach that Azerbaijan is taking to pull from these different types of stakeholders, to work with others, to kind of broker the agreement that needs to be brokered, particularly on that finance goal, but also we heard in the panel earlier on the fossil fuel transition, the need to get that energy transition planning into countries' NDCs. How can your COP be the milestone for that as well?
Thank you so much. Am I audible from the back? Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation to attend this event and share our observations and also plans for the COP29. As Fatou was very open in outlining the situation for the moment, and I would add some more elements to increase the gravity of the problem, which the World Meteorological Organization, in fact, announced that the last year was the hottest year on record, and we need to act urgently to find solutions. And the Baku COP, which is only 5 months ahead, is the first platform that we as international community can find a real solution. And I also align myself to the call of Fatou in terms of climate finance, and it will bring me to the answer to your question on how we can make sure that the international community or the parties to the convention, to Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement, can make sure that their NDCs are up to date and their ambitions are at the desired level that and it's corresponding to the current reality in terms of the climate change. So this year, the COP is labeled as Finance COP, the COP29. We are all expected to deliver in Baku on the new climate finance goal that will be take into account the floor amount of 100 billion and to find which could be the new figure that is the most important, the golden, I would say, frame for that is the figure that would be adequate to the urgency and scale of the problem. But at the same time, as the agreement put it very explicitly, take into account the needs and requirements of the developing countries. So how this finance deliverables expected from COP29 is also linked to the updated NDCs or new ambitious NDCs. For some parties, it is really a matter of real linkage. That if we want really to update the ambitions, then we need to have also means of implementation available for the parties. But at the same time, we understand the urgency and the scale of the problem is going high and high, and we need to enhance our ambitions. Therefore, recently in the Petersburg Climate Dialogue, we have announced our 2 pillars of strategy and vision for COP29, which is enhancing ambition and enabling action. Enhancing ambition on one hand means how we are going to support the parties to raise their ambitions through their new updated NDCs, national adaptation plans, and the biennial transparency reports that they are going to submit. And on the other hand, we need to equip them with relevant ammunition, with a means of implementation so that they can realize those ambitions that they have raised. Ambassador of Samoa very explicitly mentioned how challenging the climate change is for the small island developing states. I have personally been to Caribbean recently, to Antigua, Barbuda, and Barbados, and we had a chance to see by our own eyes how these communities are suffering on spot from the first-hand real impact of the climate change. And for most of them, this is a matter of existential threat. Mm-hmm. And they are not sure whether tomorrow when they wake up, they can find their countries existing or not. So therefore, the level of concern is different across the countries. And the level of responsibility is should be also corresponding to the level of threat. So we need to, all countries come together in a global effort, regardless of our development level, regardless of our geography, whether we are island states or continental states, and we need to agree on such solutions that could really make an impact on the process. So Baku COP, regardless of the fact that it's being labeled as financing COP, but we frame it as enabling COP. Enabling COP means in different way, and we want to enable the action on climate front through mobilizing the people, mobilizing finance or resources, and mobilizing solutions. This is a strategy that we are going to follow in the near future. Recently in Bonn, we had started already negotiations for potential deliverables in the Baku COP. Two major deliverables are being expected from Baku. One is new collective quantified goal, as we just referred to. Another one is Article 6 on carbon markets. This is also a long-standing unresolved issue among the parties to agree, and this, in our view, also be a very important instrumental deliverable that could also help many developing countries to have the necessary means of implementation for realizing their ambitions. But at the same time, we have prioritized enhanced transparency framework to be operationalized. We are working with the parties to come up with their biennial transparency reports, first time in the history, to give us a very transparent picture of how they have implemented so far the ambitions that they have announced, and what is needed for them to perform better. So what are the major shortcomings in order for the climate community to try to address it. But at the same time, we are developing our action agenda, the presidency initiatives, also to be complementing what is going on in the negotiation track by coming up with some important initiatives like the one which is both on climate front and also on the development front is very important. We call it COP Truce, which is a global ceasefire. As you know, we are, according to UN Secretary General, we have 52 conflicts around the world. And armed conflicts, besides being a real threat to international peace and security, also is a source of emission. 5 to 6% of the global emission is on military activities. So the conflicts around the world and the military activities are really a great source of concern also from that point of view. We will be announcing the COP truce, a global ceasefire for the period of COP, in order not to maintain international peace and security, but at the same time to contribute to the reduction of emission activities. And there are several more initiatives on agriculture, land, water, and investing in human capital, and there are a lot that we will be announcing further.
Fantastic. And my apologies. I hope that we can come into those as we get into the discussion, and I'm sure our audience will also be particularly interested to hear how you're going about bringing those coalitions together. This idea of a COP truce sounds like it's a diplomatic challenge, definitely. How are you going to mobilize that agreement on something that's that big alongside this big climate finance question that needs to be decided at COP as well? Jake, can we move on to you? And we know that the EU has long been a leader alongside the small island states in climate diplomacy and has particularly been taking a more partnerships approach and bringing in different elements of the EU's diplomatic levers, its trade agenda, its development finance agenda, to try and enable some of the climate action that we need to see from other countries. We've also had some big political shifts in the EU recently. We'd love to hear from you how you expect those political shifts might change the EU's approach, or what else might need to change in the EU's approach to diplomacy to get countries, to help countries kind of get to those NDCs that add up to that 1.5 degree pathway. We see kind of Kenya on fire a little bit at the moment, riots starting to bring these questions of access to finance and debt sustainability into the question as well. How is that forming part of the EU's approach to climate diplomacy these days?
Well, thanks for the question, and thanks for allowing me to join such an excellent panel. The urgency and the passion that we heard from the EOS's perspective, and then I think the subtlety, nuance, and openness to ideas that we're hearing from the incoming COP presidency. I mean, the EU brings into these negotiations a degree of stability in terms of our approach to climate change, which I think has its foundation, first and foremost, in the fact that if you poll European citizens about the issue of climate change, you'll find that the vast majority believes that the science tells us that climate change is a serious risk, and they want their governments to act upon it and act upon it in urgency. And although there have been some political shifts within the makeup of EU governments, that fact has remained largely stable. And I think it's because of that basis in science. It's also, I think we've seen demonstrated that we're willing to turn that science into law, which gives stability across different electoral cycles. We have now the European climate law that is in effect and in force that requires us to be at net zero by 2050. There are other jurisdictions that have that as well. That's an essential part of stability within the European framework. And then, of course, we're seeing that the economics of climate change are working in the EU's favor as well. As we begin to invest more and more in renewables and energy efficiency, we see that we're gaining more energy security, but we're also seeing that we're becoming a more innovative and effective and prosperous society as a result of those interventions. So that combination of what the science tells us, the fact that we have this underpinning in our legal system, and it's being confirmed by the economics, then allows the politics to remain relatively stable over time. So with this latest round of European parliamentary elections, we see that essentially the center has held. It is the center-right, but it's essentially that same center-right that delivered the European Green Deal, the most ambitious set of climate policies, I would say, of any party to the Paris Agreement. This new commission, the incoming commission, which of course we don't know exactly how it's going to be led at the top level or even at the level of commissioners, and doesn't yet have a mandate from the Parliament in terms of exactly what it will be doing next, I think will continue to support the kind of diplomacy that we've been carrying out so far, which is diplomacy based on leadership by example. So the way in which we will be implementing our Fit for 55 package, I think will provide an example of how it is that you move from simply making commitments at the international level to actually putting in place the policies necessary to deliver that ambition. And Fatou made this very important point that we have to make sure that as our COPs become more and more ambitious in terms of what we're asking the world to do, as we did quite dramatically in Dubai, we aren't creating a bigger gap between what it is that we're actually doing at home. And I think it's going to be a very important part of the deliverables from Baku to demonstrate through the preparation of NDCs, but also through the NCQG, that implementation is now very much at the forefront. So the incoming commission will definitely focus on that as a way of leading by example. Partnerships, as you mentioned, an absolutely key part of what the EU does in terms of advancing ambitious climate policy around the world. You mentioned trade, you mentioned investment. I think this is going to be a key part of the rollout of our external dimension of our climate policies under the new commission as well. Finally, our commitment to the multilateral rules-based system, the Paris Agreement, obviously, but there are other elements of that system that are evolving in a very dynamic way at the moment. Trade rules, I think, are now beginning to have to adjust the way in which they're managing international markets to take into account more clearly the fact that climate policy in some ways needs to shape trade rules rather than the other way around. And then very importantly, as was mentioned by the ambassador, the fact that the international legal system is now being activated to put forward those very important pleas for evidence of more climate justice coming through the international agreements that we've made so far, but also what we call the customary rules of international law that clearly imply that we have to take more seriously our obligations to protect our citizens and citizens around the world. So there will be a stability, but I think that there will be an evolving new set of tools that the EU will be able to deploy in the next stage of these negotiations.
Very interesting, and it'd be great to come to you next, Camilla. You've had some experience in the COP26 presidency, the COP28 presidency, in getting some of those bigger and bolder commitments made at the international level. How do presidencies play a role in turning that into actual delivery on the ground? What role do coalitions play? What value is there still in getting these big, bold commitments made at the international level? It would be great to have your perspective.
Well, first thing to say is it's not easy. Don't worry. There are lots of others that will be with you as well. And the way that COPs come together, I mean, this is such a vibrant ecosystem that work around the UN climate negotiations. And I think that's been an incredibly important part of helping to shape these kind of outcomes and deliverables. Over time, it was a conversation, it started, before the Paris Agreement, in fact, before the Copenhagen negotiations, that this was a process about taking every country in the world, bringing them together at the international space and saying, how do we come up with a framework in which we're going to move forwards to take action on climate change? We're now at a point where we have that framework, and so instead we have to think about how we deliver it. And we all know that despite the fact that we have moved a long way, and I think sometimes we can be in these conversations and feel very negative about the fact that there's so much more to do, but really, if we look back, if you told me 15 years ago when I went to my first COP, which is embarrassing, that we would be this far along, I would have never have believed it. We've made huge amounts of progress, but nonetheless, there's a lot more that we need to do. And as we've moved forward, there has been a real appetite to show that we're making progress on the implementation, on the real delivery. And that has involved bringing more market actors to the fore, and that might be those who shape markets through institutions, those who shape markets through their investments, it might be through their business practices, together with governments, who ultimately are the biggest arbiters of shaping markets often, to put forward different approaches which say, this is how we're going to do it. And I think since the Paris Agreement, we have seen those coalitions build together to come up with ways forward, different targets which reflect on that NDC commitment or that high-level target that they've said on net zero or on percentage emissions reductions, to show that in a particular sector, if that's on methane or that's on coal or that's on insurance and resilience. But now we're kind of at the next stage of the evolution. It's been very helpful to set the tone, to set the direction, to set the level of ambition, and for countries and different actors to come along with that. But now people want to say, okay, but where's the plan that goes with that? Where's your investment? Where's your way of doing things? What are you putting into this game to prove that you're going to deliver on it? So I do think it's really important, but I think that we've moved maybe from targets and percentages to coalitions and targets, but more sectoral, more specific. And I think the appetite now is moving to more programmatic. So how do you go about doing the doing of that, not just the intention of that direction?
Definitely, and as Fatou suggested, how do we make sure that different perspectives are brought into developing that more programmatic approach to planning transitions? We have had some great perspectives from you all. I don't think we've quite solved exactly the recipe to getting to the decisions at COP29 and the plans that we need countries to deliver. So we want to open that up to the audience to add your ideas into the mix, add your suggestions to this panel. How do we get to COP29? How do we mobilize the whole of society diplomacy that our scientists, that our ambassadors from different countries can bring to the fore? I'd like to start, I know we've got a special guest in the audience, Australia's ambassador for climate change, Kristen Tilley. It'd be great to have a bit of perspective from you and perhaps a question to the panel to kick us off. And then please do raise your hand so that we can come to other questions from the audience as well.
Thanks, Camilla. I don't feel that special, folks, but thank you for that kind introduction. I was going to grab Yalchin afterwards and ask him a question, so maybe I can use this opportunity to do so. Maybe I'll start with, of course, Ambassador Strickland's very powerful and very real reason why we need to take action on climate change. And that Pacific existential reality around the impacts of climate change, which we touched on briefly, is something Australia understands really, really acutely. And so that is why, for what it's worth, Australia's bidding to host a future COP. And we like the way that the UNFCCC Troika model has been brought in now, so that you have current, next and future COP working together to, instead of having sort of this moving feast of what's going to be the focus, a bit more consistency and momentum building around the things that matters. So For what it's worth, as a future prospective COP host, we think there's some real advances in the architecture and the way that COPs are operating that's very useful. As I started, we're bidding to host COP in 2026 as a Pacific COP with our colleagues from the Pacific. I had heard previously, Yalchin, that at the Baku COP this year, there is an intention to focus on SIDS as well, potentially with a standalone summit. I'd love to get an update on the thinking around that if possible. Thanks.
Great question. And perhaps, Yalchin, we could ask you to also touch on how the work with the Troika of presidencies is going, how that's helping you get to the COP29 outcome.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador, for the question. Troika was one of the most innovative ideas that has come up in the COP process. We are working very closely with UAE and Brazil to support the parties to come up with their ambitious NDCs through also including the support of the UN system. We as Troika members addressed a letter to the Secretary General who, in response, of course, mentioned that the UN system would stand ready to help the countries and parties to update their NDCs. The Troika format is also very important to ensure the continuity of the progress and not to each time to invent new things and to come up with new ideas and forgetting about the previous progress that has been achieved. So we are talking to each other to ensure the continuity, and I think we need to have this Troika to be moving, not to be only these three countries having this, but to moving in the future as we started to see the positive advantages of this issue. On small island developing states, our geographic priority for COP29 presidency is small island developing states, and that was based on this idea. We have attended the SIDS conference in Antigua Barbuda together with the COP president and also visited Barbados. And we are planning now to go to Tonga in August and Samoa in October for Chagon events, also to have Pacific to be covered when it comes to formulating our strategy on how we are going to deal with the SIDS countries. As a standalone summit event, there will be some events within the COP that we will be also taking into account the needs and priorities of the small island developing states. Recently, we hosted some leaders from the small island developing states in Baku, and we will continue to work with them. And very soon, we will also announce a special program for small island developing states, both to ensure their participation at the COP in Baku and also to plan and ensure that their needs and requirements be met to make them more resilient to the adverse impacts of the climate change.
Very interesting. Let's bring in some more perspectives from the audience. I can see two questions at the front here. Could we go to the lady in green first? And if my panel doesn't mind, we might take two questions and then come to you for some answers.
Thanks so much. Ritvika Sengupta from British Standards Institute. Really great to hear from the panel that we're moving into the kind of time of doing. As part of that and as part of policy implementation, do you think we should also be talking about capacity building and resourcing government departments, the public sector, regulators who will actually be on the ground doing the checking and building that trust? Yeah, thanks.
Great question. And in the front, in the middle, third row in.
Hi guys, Piotr Kazin with Carbon Tracker, previously World Bank Crisis Group sort of things. Firstly, the bill has been rejected by President Ruto, so I think that's quite a positive step for democracy. Still, my question is about climate change as a threat multiplier. And something that I'm concerned about, having lived in Africa for a while and working in policy, is the lack of talk about climate security. Now, if you want to be able to ensure economic prosperity and sustainable development, you need a, sustainable place to do that. So how can we get climate security more involved in the conversation? But also, this is a year of elections. More countries than ever are going to the polls. How can we ensure that youth, to Fatau's wonderful contribution, are mobilized? They're more informed, but if you look at statistics, they're less and less actually engaged. About 65% of the youth are actually going to vote in the US election versus 94% for 65 plus. So what can we do from the human security aspect as well? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So a question around capacity building departments and regulators, and how do we mobilize these different elements of society and use that security angle? Maybe, Camilla, we could start with you, as you touched on the first question in particular in your first intervention. What's your take?
So absolutely, we live in a totally different world now where climate isn't just to prepare for a COP, it comes into every little thing that we do across a government, across an institution, across our businesses, investors, civil society, everything. And this is not a world that we've ever lived in. So I really think that we need to give ourselves permission to learn. We need to be better at learning together. We need to be better at allowing ourselves to make mistakes and then working through that. I also think that we have to be very careful about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's going to be bumpy, this transition. And it's going to be bumpy because of elections, which was just touched on. And it's going to be bumpy because we'll make mistakes and technologies will be different than we expect. But we've got to stay the course. And I think that's the thing that reassures me. I don't see any going back on this direction of travel. It's all a question of speed. But we do need to think about how we resource people. And I think that actually speaks to the youth point. Maybe youth aren't engaging in voting, but a lot of young people are choosing where to work because they want to be part of that capacity. And so I think that experience, I come from a youth climate activist background a long time ago, way before it was cool. That has stayed with me, and that's something, that energy is part of how I do things. And just to speak very briefly on the security point, absolutely, it's something that's been a very academic conversation for a long time, and now it's a very lived reality. I think that it does penetrate in the security field, particularly in the military space, because they practically have to practice and experience what they're doing because it's the reality they're operating in. But when it comes to how do we make different choices around conflict prevention, about peacekeeping, about resources, we're not there yet, and that's something that really needs a lot more development and engagement.
Interesting. Please go ahead, Ambassador.
No, thank you very much, because I was hoping our COP president will go first so I can thank him for putting the spotlight on SIDS for the upcoming COP. And that we guarantee we'll stand united with the COP president to bring that level of ambition. For us, since maybe the first COP, we have always asked for a more ambitious, implementation-focused COP, every COP. But now more than ever, with the window closing and us staying on the right path, I think the next COP, we will definitely stand united with the COP presidency, hopefully to deliver what we as SIDS expect from every COP. One that's transformational and one that keeps us 1.5 stay alive goal. Now, on capacity building, obviously as SIDS, it's always high on our agenda, and it is an issue that we constantly, resource constraint is very much part of our lived reality, be it human resources or financial resources. So completely agree with you. So for example, a lot of the key asks, we talk about climate finance, and it's important, and about accessing the finance for us as SIDS. But for example, in the case of Samoa also, it's not just about access. It's having the capacity to use the funds, make sure that we deliver the whole project to the end, and that it has the impact that you intended. So it's not just about accessing the funds, but having the capacity to implement all these climate actions, climate-related projects. And on climate security, again, for decades we've always fought. As the Pacific, it's always been a security issue for us as Pacific SIDS. We tried to bring it in the UN Security Council. So I completely agree. There's different angles you can look at it on the climate security side, from a threat side. And like I said, in our regional security architecture, climate change is high on that agenda. Even in our national agenda, climate change is one of the highest threats there is in terms of our own security policies. But on youth participation, I strongly agree, and as I mentioned, the ICJ resolution that was championed by Vanuatu, the youth were very much strong advocates that helped us as SIDS and helped us, help pursue climate justice, and they still are a strong voice. What we call for is not just to bring that voice to the COPs, but they should bring it to, at the national level, to put pressure on those who need to be pressured, but also to work with us at national level, be it implementation. So, involving youth, involving women, and the voices that we need to hear, not only at COPs, but in between COPs and where it counts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And perhaps we'll take another couple of questions, and if our other panelists want to come in on security and capacity building, please do as well. I can see a question towards the back up there, and on the side standing up. Good on you for standing for the panel.
Thank you. Christine Versova, School of Public Health, Imperial College London.
Could you hold the mic a little bit?
Yeah, sure. From the previous panel, we saw that health is a huge co-benefit to a lot of climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts. COP28 had the first health interministerial meeting convening 50 health ministers together. And it was also quite a big landmark for us because the Health and Climate Declaration was signed at COP28. So I'm curious to hear what insights can you offer us on what is planned for COP29 in terms of health, and what would you like to see, and how can we help? Thank you.
And we'll take the other question just a little bit in from you there.
Hello, I'm Jamie Anderson. I'm a special advisor to the UK Parliament, talking around politics with an election next week and a potential change. I just wondered, seeing as we are sat in London, if the panel had any views on the kind of direction the next UK government should be taking on how we use our climate diplomacy to the best effect.
Great. Two different but very interesting questions. I wonder, Yalchin, should we come to you first, particularly on that health question?
Yes, I'll start with health, question on health. Yes, health issues also will be on the spotlight of COP29. We will have a separate thematic day where health will be one of our priority topics. We have one of our action agenda initiatives on investing in human capital, which includes also a health component within it. But also from the air pollution point of view, we will have a specific approach to the health issues because human health is being affected from the polluted air very much, and super pollutants, there's not only the CO2 gases that is being emitted, but other non-CO2 gases are also polluting the air and creating negative conditions for the human health. So we will be having some events to be organized before the COP and during the COP in the Health Day to addressing this topic of super pollutants, so-called. And also the Health Ministerial will be again held this year in Azerbaijan as well, bringing together with some potential outcomes, tangible outcomes announced for the international community. On expectations from the new UK government, the UK is the fourth biggest donor in the international climate finance architecture, and we of course would like to see UK's this prominent role to be continued, the proactive role in the international climate action agenda, but at the same time to reinforce it with some additional element, mobilizing the support of some other countries around it. And coming back to the previous question, I would like to touch upon the youth mobilization issue. So we have a youth champion, she's also around in London, and she's reaching out to some other stakeholders here during the Climate Week. And she's only 23 years old and trying to build the bridge and be the voice of the youth representatives from different international organizations. I've met with Yango, with those accredited by UNFCCC Youth NGO Coalition, with whom I'm meeting regularly to hear them, since the negotiation process is a party-driven process, but we need also to integrate non-party stakeholders' voices also into the process. So I'm listening to them and trying to also reflect their ideas in the negotiation process. Will be also taken into account in the run-up to COP29. And on the capacity building and election issues, this year is a year of elections. It's more than 4 billion people this year is voting in more than 60 countries. And in addition to already challenging context of the climate negotiations, especially on finance, this external factor of elections also is an important element that we need to take into account and also start planning some contingency, to have some contingency planning for the results of this kind of elections. And on capacity building is as part of means of implementation is necessary not only in our internal circumstances to have a relevant capacity within our authorities to deal with the adverse impact of the climate change, but also we are trying to assist others, to support other countries by organizing some workshops, capacity building exercises, especially on the BTRs and biannual transparency reports, so that they can submit it. And it's a learning by doing exercise, and we hope that this process will yield really positive outcomes.
Yeah, interesting, and perhaps something that could be taken into this question of how does COP29 become a pivotal moment to push countries on their NDCs and have those NDCs taking this more programmatic approach that Camilla was talking about. How can this capacity building come into your COP29 agenda as well? Could be an interesting one to get our audience's perspective on in the networking later. But could we move to you, Jake? And I wonder if we can supplement the question around what would we like to see from the next UK government with a question that came up in a panel earlier. So great framing of a question. How would you make the case to a new UK government to increase their investment in climate action from developing countries, particularly on the adaptation side? Could I pose that one to you?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's not my role, obviously, in real life to make that.
If you were advising me how to make the case,
absolutely.
Perhaps,
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I can say that we do spend time advising our own development cooperation unit within the European Commission, our International Partnerships Directorate General, to mainstream climate finance into everything that it does. And I think that the same arguments would be made to the UK government. I mean, first and foremost, as others have said, you really can't do effective development cooperation these days if you're not building in a resilience component to your work. You have to take into account that we're operating in a warming world, and so any investment in whether it's at the household level, the government level that you're doing through development cooperation has to take into account the need for greater risk assessment and building in resilience. So it is in the interests of the countries that we're partnering with to build adaptation more into the projects that we partner with them on. And then, as others pointed out in a previous panel, it's in the donor's interest as well. This is one of the ways in which we try to ensure greater stability in the world, and we address anticipated needs up front rather than having to deal with the consequences later on. So it's just a matter of wise investment to prioritize adaptation, and particularly with regard to grant-based funding, where adaptation can't compete with mitigation with regard to access to private sector, although there is a 6-step plan to get businesses more engaged, which is great to hear. I wanted to say a few words about capacity building, because our development cooperation also focuses a lot on building capacity. Transparency is an area that's absolutely essential, not just for the need for the international community to better understand what each party is doing in terms of implementing its NDCs, getting its greenhouse gas emissions under control, but also that's the same capacity that they need in order to regulate domestically as well. You need to be able to monitor greenhouse gases within your society, build them into your national inventory if you are then going to manage those gases as well. The EU also provides a maybe less welcome form of capacity building as well, because we are a first mover when it comes to regulation. And it's essential for us increasingly for our consumers to make sure that the products that we import into the EU are as low carbon as possible. That requires our trading partners to be able to measure the embedded carbon within the products that they're exporting to the EU. And that requires a lot of capacity building. And we're realizing this as we're beginning to roll out regulations such as the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure and the regulations on deforestation, that it will only work if it's combined with building the capacity of our trading partners to be able to collect that data and to share it with us in the context of trade. So that's an additional element.
Interesting perspective on capacity building, definitely, and the types of policy interventions in that broader foreign policy sphere. But perhaps coming back to one of your points, Camilla, about building the coalitions to try and drive some of those ideas into delivery. We have reached time, I'm afraid, so that leaves me to thank our panel. Thank you for your perspectives. Huge thanks to the audience as well.